The first man to tell her to run was already bleeding into the snow. He had gone down hard on the west face of the ridge, sliding 2 meters through loose shale before his vest caught on a low shelf of stone. His carbine skidded away, hit a rock, and stopped just short of the drop. Above him, muzzle flashes snapped from 3 different elevations, bright and brief in the dark, disciplined enough to mean the men on the other side had done this before. Chief Petty Officer Elias Van was 15 feet downslope with his cheek against freezing dirt. One knee twisted under him, his medical pack half open, listening to rounds break the air with a flat, ugly sound that came only when they were close. He saw Sam Danner press his gloved hand under his ribs. Saw blood push through the fabric anyway. Saw him turn his head uphill toward the woman who should not have still been there. "Run!" Danner shouted. She did not move at first. Tracer washed red across the rocks. Snow dust kicked up from the ridge like flour. Someone on the radio was calling for a status check. No one had time to answer. And in the middle of it, with the whole slope trying to kill them one burst at a time, she looked past the wounded man, past the blood, past the open dark below them, and fixed her eyes on the rifle lying in the shale. That was the moment Elias understood 2 things at once. The first was that he had misjudged her. The second was that if she reached that rifle, the night was about to turn into something none of them had planned for. Stay with this one. The details matter. 14 hours earlier, at Jalalabad Airfield, she had looked like somebody headquarters had attached to satisfy a requirement. That was Elias's first mistake. The briefing room was a plywood box with 2 humming heaters, a warped projector screen, and the smell of wet canvas baked into the walls. It was late afternoon, cold enough outside that the mechanics on the line moved with their shoulders tucked in and their hands buried under their armpits between tasks. Inside, the assault troops stood in a half circle around the map board, helmets clipped to plate carriers, rifles slung, faces worn flat by repetition. They had done enough pre-mission briefs to know which details mattered and which details would be outdated before the rotors even turned. Elias stood near the back with his notebook folded into his cargo pocket and a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand. 16 years in uniform had taught him to watch the room before he listened to it. Men said useful things in briefs. They said more with their posture. Senior Chief Wade Cutter was at the front, one hand on the edge of the table, broad shoulders rolled slightly forward the way they always were when he was trying not to show impatience. Cutter ran the troop on target. He trusted rehearsals, speed, and clean violence applied at the right place and time. He did not trust unnecessary variables. The woman at the far end of the room was, to him, exactly that. She wore desert camouflage without any attempt to soften it. Army patch, cultural support team tab, no jewelry, hair pulled tight and hidden. A carbine leaned against the wall by her boot. Her name, Tape Red Keen. She did not try to introduce herself while the room settled, did not force eye contact, did not smile for acceptance. She set a green notebook on the table, unscrewed a pen, and waited for the mission to start. That was Elias's second mistake. He took quiet for passivity. The target package was thin, which usually meant the people who built it did not trust it enough to pad it. Objective: a mountain compound north of the Pesh River, Kinner Province, at 8,900 feet, occupied by a facilitator named Carrie Baser and believed to be hosting a courier arriving before dawn. Baser was not famous enough for headlines, which was exactly why men like him lasted. He moved ammunition, money, and names. 2 of those names had turned up on components recovered from 3 pressure plate bombs in the last 6 weeks. One of those bombs had torn open a Marine convoy outside Asadabad. Another had killed an Afghan district chief. The third had failed to detonate only because the battery leads had shaken loose. The window was narrow. Signals intercept suggested Baser would move before first light with a courier and an external guide. If the team missed him that night, he would likely cross east into ground where no one in the room expected easy access. The compound had women and children present. That was why Keene was there. Officially, primary infill is MH47 to an offset landing zone here. Cutter tapped the acetate overlay with a marker. 1.2 clicks south-southwest of the objective. Terrain is terraced lower down, broken shale on the upper approach. Moon illumination 32%. Temperature forecast at infill is 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind on the ridgeline 8 to 12 knots from the northwest, gusting higher after 0300. Elias looked at the woman when Cutter said wind. She made a note. Not a general note. A number. The intelligence officer continued. The source has placed baser in the upper structure for the last 3 nights. Male fighters assessed at 6 to 10. Light machine gun possible. No confirmed mortar tubes, no heavy weapons. At that, a few men in the room shifted almost invisibly. No confirmed heavy weapons in that terrain meant no one had seen enough to rule them out. Elias knew the feeling. It sat under the ribs like a stone. Attached support, the intel officer said, glancing toward Keene the way people did when they were reading a line that did not feel fully integrated into the rest of the plan. Staff Sergeant Mara Keene will accompany Assault 2 for female engagement and site exploitation as needed. No one said anything. Cutter did not need to. His silence carried the shape of his position clearly enough. He was not hostile. He was not careless. He was practical, which sometimes looked colder than either. He moved on to routes, contingencies, code words, call signs. Elias listened, drew his own small box around the times that mattered, and watched Keene without meaning to. She wrote with her left hand. The knuckle of her trigger finger on the right was rubbed flat and thickened. There was old scar tissue across the base of her thumb, pale and shiny under the fluorescent light. She did not write much, just bearings, time windows, a single grid coordinate. Then she looked up from the map to the projected surveillance photo of the objective and kept looking after everyone else had moved on. That held his attention. Most people in a brief followed the speaker. She followed the image. When the floor opened for questions, one of the younger operators asked about the exfil route if the lower draw was blocked. Another asked whether the Afghan partner force would remain at the vehicles or move in. Cutter answered both without hesitation. Then Keene spoke for the first time. "Why does the upper structure cast east shadow in the evening photo?" she asked, "if the entrance is marked on the west wall." The room went quiet for a beat, not because the question was dramatic, but because it was specific enough to require actual thought. The intelligence officer frowned at the slide, then at his notes. Image may be flipped in reproduction. Maybe, Cutter asked. The officer adjusted his glasses. "We'll confirm before wheels up." Keene looked back at the screen. "If it's mirrored and the entrance is on the east wall, your assault stack is going to arrive in the open to the high side." No challenge in her voice. No flourish. Just geometry. Elias saw Cutter turn fully toward the screen for the first time in the brief. That was the first hairline crack in the room's assumption about her. It did not become respect yet. It became attention, which was rarer and, in that world, worth more. Outside, dusk was already flattening the edges of the base. Elias found Keene 20 minutes later by the Konix where the troops staged final equipment checks. She was crouched beside her kit, laying magazines in a row on a poncho liner. Not because she had to count them, but because she was confirming touch order in low light. 5 rifle mags forward, 2 pistol mags behind. Tourniquet rubber banded high on the left shoulder strap. Chem lights taped flat. Extra radio battery wrapped in a cut-down wool sock to keep it from dying fast in the cold. That was not how support personnel packed. Elias stopped a few feet away and glanced at her weapon. M4A1, short barrel, suppressor mounted, optic already checked. No decorations. No nonsense. "You've worked mountains before?" he asked. She looked up, not startled, just measuring who was asking. Up close, she looked older than he had guessed from the file, but not by much. Early 30s, maybe. Wind had cut fine lines at the corners of her eyes. There was a narrow white mark under her jaw that might have been an old laceration. "Enough," she said. It was not an evasive answer. It was a boundary. He nodded toward the battery sock. "That part means you've learned the hard way. The cold takes what it can." Again, no wasted motion in the sentence. He introduced himself. "Elias Van. Corpsman." "I know. That might have sounded sharp from someone else. From her, it sounded factual. He let it sit. You ask good questions in briefs. Sometimes the wrong wall matters. There was a line behind that. Some experience she had no intention of opening in a staging area while rotors were being serviced 50 yards away. Elias recognized the habit. Men who stayed alive for years learned to keep their explanations expensive. A pair of operators passed behind him carrying breaching charges, and one of them, Danner, gave Keene the quick, unreadable nod men used when they had not decided whether someone belonged yet. She returned it and went back to her kit. Elias noticed one more thing before he stepped away. On the top page of her notebook, above the times and grids, she had written 3 words and boxed them twice. Third footpath missing. He did not know what it meant then. An hour later, Cutter knew. They had updated the imagery. The compound photo had in fact been mirrored in the package, which shifted the assault approach 40 degrees and changed which wall took the first stack. Worse, the corrected image showed a narrow, hard-packed path leading from the north side of the upper structure into broken rock that had not been briefed. Not a goat trail, a used trail. The source had reported 2 exits from the compound. There were 3. Cutter did not say anything dramatic when he saw the revised slide. He just looked once toward Keene, then reworked his plan. Assault 1 would block the upper trail. Assault 2 would collapse on the eastern wall. Elias, attached to 2, would stay with the breach element unless casualties forced him forward. No one apologized to her for being right. That was not the culture. But the room had shifted another inch. By the time the troop loaded, the moon had lifted thin and hard over the eastern ridges. The MH-47 sat on the line with its ramp down, big and insect-like under red maintenance lamps, rotor blades already beginning to flex with life. Men moved into it bent under packs, weapons tucked tight, faces green under night vision before the goggles were even lowered. The world inside a helicopter before infill had its own silence. Not real silence. Gear knocking metal. Crew chief signals. Turbine whine. But spoken language narrowed. Everyone turned inward and counted things that would matter later. Elias sat on the web seating with his ruck between his knees and watched Keene take the last open space opposite him. The red light cut the shape of her face into planes. She clipped into the floor ring without looking down, settled her rifle across her chest, and closed her eyes for maybe 3 seconds. Not fear, alignment. Then she opened them and looked at the floor map spread between Cutter's boots. Even here, she was studying approach angles. The bird lifted at 041. Jalalabad fell away in small sodium pools, then vanished as they banked east and climbed into black mountains where light seemed to have been erased by hand. The temperature inside the cabin dropped fast. Exhaust haze drifted back through the ramp seam. Elias pulled his gloves tighter and checked, again, that his hypothermia wrap was accessible under the medbag flap. Across from him, Danner leaned toward Keene and shouted over the engine noise, "You good on altitude?" She nodded once. He held up 3 fingers. "Hydrate." She lifted her canteen in answer. Danner gave Elias a look that said he had tried. Elias almost smiled. That was how troops made room without saying so. A practical check offered once. 27 minutes into the flight, the crew chief leaned in and signaled 2 minutes. Night vision goggles dropped. The cabin changed. Green grain replaced red shadow. Every surface sharpened. Elias saw Keene glance past him through the open side at the ridgeline, sliding beneath them. She tracked it like she was memorizing not the mountain, but the ways it could trap a man. The landing zone was not a zone so much as a compromise. A slant of frozen dirt between boulders on a shelf just wide enough for the rear wheels. The Chinook came in nose high, rotors beating white powder and grit into a storm that swallowed everything outside the ramp. Men moved into it because standing still was worse than blind motion. Elias hit the ground, crouched low, and felt cold reach through the seams of his uniform like fingers. Then the aircraft was gone. Rotor wash fell away. The mountain returned all at once. At 9,700 feet, sound traveled strangely in the dark. Distant water below. A dog barking somewhere far off, and then not again. Loose rock ticking under boots. Radio checks in clipped whispers. The team spread into order and began the climb. The first 400 meters were slow and quiet, cut across terrace fields stiff with frost and lined by low stone walls that glowed silver under night vision. The Afghan partner force remained lower, holding the vehicles and the exfil lane exactly as planned. Above them, the slope steepened into scrub and broken limestone. Breath got louder. Packs got heavier. Time narrowed to the next foot placement. Keene moved 3 men ahead of Elias, exactly where Cutter had placed her in the stack after the revised brief. Close enough to be useful at the objective, far enough back that she was not driving the assault. She climbed without conversation and without the common mistake of trying to match the pace of the biggest men. Shorter stride. No wasted vertical movement. Economical. At 1:38, they halted under a stand of black pines while Cutter and Reyes, the platoon officer, confirmed position against the last terrain checkpoint. Elias knelt, sipping from his hose to keep his mouth from drying out, and watched Keene touch 2 fingers to the ground. When she raised them, she rubbed grit between thumb and forefinger, then looked uphill. Elias leaned forward slightly. What? She did not turn. Path's fresher than the imagery. You can tell that in this light. It's not the light. She pointed with 2 fingers, low and brief, on the narrow trail ahead. Frost remained on the stones at the edges, but had been broken clean in the center. Recent traffic. More than one person. Maybe within hours. Elias looked. Once she showed him, he could see it. How many, he asked. Not goats. That was not enough to pass to Cutter as certainty, and she knew it. But 5 minutes later, when the point man reported boot sign on the same trail, Elias felt the first small adjustment happen inside his own judgment. Not admiration yet. Calibration. The compound appeared at 2:07, first as a darker cut against darkness, then as shape. 2 stone structures terraced into the mountain, one lower and rectangular, the other set higher into rock, with a retaining wall and a narrow courtyard between. Exactly the kind of place that could look poor from air and still hold a month of ammunition underground. The corrected orientation changed everything. If they had come in on the original plan, the first stack would have crossed open slope under the upper windows. Keene had been right before her boots hit the ground. Cutter split the element with hand signals. Assault 1 peeled north to block the third path. Assault 2, with Elias, Danner, Keene, and the breach man, flattened along the east wall and moved in the shadow line under the structure. The wall was colder than ice under Elias's glove. He could smell wood smoke and sheep from inside the lower room. No radio chatter from above. No sign the objective knew they were there. Then Keene touched Danner's shoulder. He turned sharply, annoyed on instinct more than thought. She pointed down. At first Elias saw nothing. Then he saw the wire. It ran from under a broken water jar near the threshold, thin as hair and laid in mortar cracks the same color as the wall. Not professional military issue. Worse, handmade and meant for someone moving fast enough to miss it. Danner froze. The breacher leaned in with a pen light hooded under his palm and traced the line to a pressure pull under loose stone beside the door. The charge was small, probably improvised from old Soviet explosive or artillery filler, enough to maim the first man through and collapse the entry in chaos. Danner looked back at Keene. Good catch. She just shifted to cover the window. The trap came off clean. Breach adjusted. Door opened inward with less noise than Elias expected. They flooded the lower room, weapons leading. 2 women. 3 children. 1 old man awake on a mat. Hands up before the light touched him. No baser. No armed fighters. Cooking pots still warm. 1 blanket missing from a sleeping row. That mattered more than the empty room. He moved in only when Cutter signaled. She crouched beside the oldest woman, spoke softly in Pashto, and in 30 seconds got more coherence than the interpreter downstairs had managed through his radio all night. What's she saying? Reyes asked. Keene listened again, eyes on the woman's face. Men left before moonrise. How many? The woman spoke quickly, glancing toward the ceiling. Keene translated without adding drama. 8, maybe 9. 1 out from here. 1 limping. They took packs from the upper room and used the north path. Cutter's jaw set. The old man began talking over the woman, voice rising. Keene cut him off with a sharper sentence than Elias had heard from her before. The man looked away. What did he say? Elias asked quietly. He said there are no men here. She rose. He said it while his hands still smelled like diesel. That was the first time Elias heard dry edge in her voice. The upper room yielded more absence. Bedding rolled. 2 ammo tins. Empty PCAM belt boxes. A battery-powered radio with the battery removed. Under a rug in the back corner, a square of floor colder than the stone around it. Danner found the seam. Hidden trapdoor. Narrow tunnel angling into the mountain. No one needed to say it. The source had sold them a static target. They had hit a transit node. The question was whether they still had time to catch what had moved through it. Cutter made the decision in under 20 seconds. Assault 1 on the north block had not taken contact and had eyes on the upper trail. No movement yet. If Baser and the courier had departed before moonrise, they were likely moving slow under load and using terrain to avoid skylining. The tunnel changed the calculus. It allowed them to stage unseen, maybe to an alternate exit farther north. If the team backed off now, Baser disappeared into 3 valleys and a border network by daylight. Reyes checked the time. 2:19. Exfil hard time was 5:10 unless weather forced earlier extraction. Dawn line would begin turning eastern ridges pale by 5:40. Too much light on those slopes, and the helicopters became invitations. Track them, Cutter said. No one argued. The tunnel exit emerged 60 meters above the upper compound behind a fold of rock that looked, from below, like part of the hill itself. There were fresh scrape marks on the lip and a torn thread on a splintered support timber. Recent, fast movement, men leaving underweight. And just beyond it, visible only when Elias lay flat and lifted his goggles with one hand to kill the bloom, was the 3rd footpath Keene had written in her notebook hours earlier. It cut north along the contour, then vanished in a broken ground toward a saddle shaped like a missing tooth between 2 black ridges. Elias looked at her. She was already looking there. The pursuit began as a line of shadows across frozen earth. No talking above a whisper. Intervals tight enough not to lose contact, wide enough not to die in a single burst if they were seen. Elias moved mid-column, med-bag, digging into his shoulders, rifle angled low. The cold deepened as the night matured. Every breath stung. Sweat from the climb began to cool under armor, which was its own tax. They found the first dropped evidence at 2:43. A strip of black cloth torn on thorn brush. Not local weave. Machine-finished edge. Then a few meters later, the crushed foil backing from an antibiotic blister pack, imported and recent. Then, in a patch of soft earth between stones, the clear, deep tread of a boot with a split heel and foreign sole pattern. Not village footwear, Danner whispered. No, Elias said. Keene crouched by the print, touched its edge lightly, then stood and scanned not the ground but the ridgeline above it. What? Cutter asked from up front. Nothing, she said. Elias almost missed it. The briefest narrowing around her eyes. Not nothing. Something unfinished. They moved again. At 3:01, the wind shifted. It came down the draw harder than forecast, carrying the mineral smell of snow and the older, uglier scent of cold ash. The team entered a narrow wash choked with waist-high brush and scattered boulders, its floor dry now, but cut deep enough that spring runoff would have turned it violet. The saddle they wanted lay beyond it, 200 vertical feet higher and maybe 600 meters north. On paper, it was the fastest route. In the dark, under time, it was also the most obvious. Elias knew Cutter knew that. He also knew they did not have a better option without giving the valley away. The radio hissed. Assault 1's element leader, holding farther west, reported negative movement and worsening visibility on his side. Reyes acknowledged. Then the net clipped dead for a full 3 seconds before returning. Keene turned her head toward the handset, as if she had felt the pause in her teeth. Dead ground, Elias murmured. Maybe, she said. Again, not certainty. Concern held in reserve. Halfway through the wash, they came upon a boy. He could not have been more than 12. Thin coat, no hat, plastic sandals held together with cord, standing motionless beside a boulder as if he had been placed there and forgotten. Elias's body reacted before his mind did. Weapons came up. The point man closed distance fast, pinned him against the rock, hands checking sleeves and waistband for detonator wires. Nothing. The boy's face was white with cold and terror, But when Keen knelt in front of him and spoke, Elias saw something that raised the hair on his neck. The boy looked not at her, but past her up the wash. She asked another question. The boy answered too quickly. Then he glanced uphill again. Keen stood. What did he say? Cutter asked. He says he's lost. Cutter waited. She looked up the draw a second time. He's not lost. Meaning he was told what to say if we found him. The boy started talking louder, too loud, desperate now. Keen's voice sharpened and cut through his. He flinched. Then, very quietly, she said, there are men in the rocks above the water cut. He says they told him to wait until he saw lights. Cutter's hand closed into a fist. Hold! The whole line froze. Elias lowered himself behind a stone and began seeing the wash differently. Not a route. A funnel. High rocks on both sides. Limited lateral movement. Brush dense enough to slow a break left or right. Sound trapped and folded. Can you trust him? Reyes asked. No, Keen said. But I trust where he keeps looking. That did it. Cutter rerouted immediately, pulling the team out of the center cut and up the western lip one man at a time, using brush and rock to break silhouette. Slow, exposed, miserable work. But 20 meters higher, with the wash below them and the saddle still reachable across broken side slope, Elias felt something colder than the air move through him. If the boy was bait, the ambush had been ready before they entered the draw. That meant the enemy had been watching farther back than the compound, which meant someone had predicted not just where they would go, but how. The first rounds came 30 seconds after they cleared the lip. Not at them. Into the wash they had just vacated. PCAM fire hammered the dry channel from the eastern rocks. Long, disciplined bursts that chewed brush and stone to pieces. A second gun opened from farther north, lower caliber, probably RPK or a well-positioned AK on rapid cyclic, stitching through the choke point where the first 3 men in the stack would have been. Dirt fountained. Branches shattered. The boy screamed once and was lost under the noise. No one in Elias's line returned fire because there was no clean target yet, and Cutter was too disciplined to waste muzzle flash for emotion. They flattened behind the western stones while the guns below finished killing the route they had almost taken. When the firing stopped, the mountain seemed to listen to itself. Elias looked toward Keen. Her face was still. That was the second real proof, and this time it belonged to the whole team. She had not found a useful detail. She had kept them out of slaughter. Cutter crawled 3 meters to where she and Reyes were pressed behind a rock ledge. Elias could not hear every word over the wind, but he heard enough. How long have they had eyes on us? Reyes asked. Keen answered before Cutter did. Long enough to place the boy after the compound. Cutter looked at her once hard. You think the source burned us? I think somebody knew where we come from. She glanced back toward the slope. And I think they want us moving uphill. It was a line that changed the entire night. Up to then, the team had believed they were pursuing a retreating target. Now, Elias felt the shape reverse. Baser's people were not just escaping. They were shaping contact, pulling a stronger force into terrain prepared in layers. The mountain had not swallowed the objective. The objective had moved the mountain between them. Reyes checked his watch. 3:12. Hard weather call would come soon from the aircraft if the forecast worsened. If they disengaged now, they could still exfil clean with nothing but bad intelligence and a near miss. If they pushed, they might catch the facilitators, recover the network, and end the threat that had already buried too many men in roads built from dirt and pressure plates. Cutter listened to the north and made a decision Elias would later replay 100 times. Bound west. Gain the shoulder. We take the high side before they set the next gun. No bravado. Just the least bad option. They began climbing again. The side slope was brutal. Loose rock over frozen subsoil, juniper roots hidden under powdery dust, angle steep enough that every third step slid half of itself away. Elias's calves burned. Men breathed through open mouths now, steam silvering in the dark. The saddle ahead widened into a shoulder of broken limestone backed by a ridge line maybe 30 feet higher than the surrounding terrain. If the enemy held it first, they would own every approach. If the team got there first, the contact might flatten into a fight instead of an execution. At 3:26, Danner found blood on a stone. Not much. 3 drops. Dark, half-frozen, recent enough to shine under infrared. The limp, Elias whispered. Keen was already scanning the next 10 meters. He's not the rear man, she said. Danner looked at her. How do you know? If he was rear security, they'd have slowed for him. The track spacing doesn't change. She pointed to the ground, where boot prints staggered through a pinch in the rock. They protected him in the middle. Danner took that in and nodded once. A few minutes later, the proof arrived. They caught sight of movement across a narrow ravine on the opposing slope. 3 figures low among the rocks, then a fourth hauling something longer and heavier than a rifle. Elias watched through his optic, not just retreating fighters. One man stopped, braced, and turned a tube-shaped object downslope before the others pulled him on. Launcher, someone whispered. Could have been recoilless. Could have been RPG with spare rounds. Either way, it meant the no heavy weapons assessment from the brief had become a dead document. Cutter shifted the line faster. The first direct contact hit at 3:34. A single shot cracked from above and to the right, not wild, not probing. Intentional. It struck the point man's front plate and knocked him flat without penetrating, but the impact spun him into open rock. The second shot came before he finished falling. Missed by inches. Now the hillside was awake. The team answered with controlled fire, short bursts, and pairs aimed at flash and geometry. Elias dragged the point man behind cover, checked him in seconds, breath intact, bruised hard, not dead, and shoved him back into the line. Keen was 2 positions over, firing from kneeling, not rushing the trigger. Each shot separated clean enough to mean she had actual discipline and not range day confidence. Across the ravine, a shadow lifted too high to relocate. Her rifle barked once. The shadow disappeared. No celebration. She shifted immediately to the next rock seam. Elias felt Danner look at her. Even in the green wash of night vision, the glance had weight. The fight lengthened. Not a full assault. Not yet. More like the enemy was peeling them, testing distance, forcing them to spend time and attention before the real ground. Every time the team tried to push 5 or 6 meters, another shot or burst pinned the lead element long enough to make the advance costly. Reyes got on the radio for Assault 1 to swing and cut off the northern escape, but static swallowed half the transmission. The reply came broken and late. Dead ground again. No, worse than dead ground. Interference. Whether deliberate or not, Elias could not tell, but the net had become unreliable at exactly the wrong altitude. At 3:48, snow began to fall. Not a storm yet. Fine, dry crystals skimming sideways in the wind. Too light to matter for movement, but enough to soften contrast and eat distance. The ridge line ahead faded at the edges. The enemy on the far slope got harder to read. So did the ground underfoot. Cutter gathered Reyes, Danner, Elias, and after the briefest hesitation, Keen behind a limestone outcrop shaped like a broken tooth. The plan came in whispers and hand cuts over the map board in Cutter's glove. There's a split 30 meters ahead, he said. Left branch climbs to the shoulder. Right branch drops under it and hooks north. They'll expect the shoulder. Too good a firing line. We feint left, push right with 2, cut behind a gun position, and roll them off the ridge. Reyes nodded, then looked toward Keen. You stay center. She said nothing. Cutter glanced at her. You heard me. That should have settled it. It almost did. Then Keen lifted 2 fingers and pointed at the map's contour lines, not the verbal routes. The right branch dead ends if the shelf collapses here. Cutter's face tightened. You know that how? She reached into a pouch, pulled out the revised photo packet folded into quarters, and opened one infrared image under a shielded red lens. In the corner, nearly invisible unless someone had spent real time with it, was a lighter smear below the north face. Old slide, she said. Maybe 2 winters ago. Maybe 3. The snow collects differently. Reyes leaned closer. Cutter did too. If it goes, Elias said, seeing it now, the whole right hook bunches at the turn. And if they know the terrain better than we do, Keen said, they don't need to cover the whole branch. Just the choke. Cutter looked at her for a long second. In another unit, with another man, Pride might have fought that moment. Not with Cutter. Not if lives were involved. What's your play? She answered immediately, as if she had already built it in her head, but had waited to be asked. Use the lower rock seam for cover. Move west another 40 meters. There's a cutback to the shoulder from behind. Slower, but it keeps us under their sight line until the last 10. How sure? Enough. That word could have sounded reckless. From her, it sounded measured against a private scale. Cutter changed the plan. No one commented on it. No one needed to. In units like that, the man whose idea kept people alive on the next 10 minutes, whatever his rank or patch. The cutback route was filthy and cramped and better than the alternative. It threaded under an overhang, across a shelf no wider than a boot length in places, then rose through broken stone in a dogleg that hid them from the ridge until the very top. Elias went through sideways at one point, med-bag scraping rock, and thought how close they had come to taking the prettier route into a collapse zone. The enemy fired twice in an empty space where they must have expected the team to appear. Keene heard it and looked once toward Cutter. He did not look back. He just moved faster. At 4:02, they reached the backside of the shoulder. The ridge top lay maybe 12 meters above, marked by low scrub and a scatter of black rocks. Beyond it, somewhere were the gun positions that had been managing the valley. Beyond those, Baser if he was still with them, or the courier, or the man with the launcher, or all three. Cutter split the assault. Danner with 2 men left. Reyes right. Elias center between them, so he could collapse to whichever side took the first casualty. Keene stayed near Reyes, not because anyone had formally redrawn her role, but because the line had already shifted around reality. The crest broke under them all at once. Men rose. Rifles cleared. The shoulder erupted. 2 fighters were closer than expected, tucked behind a low wall of stone on the north face. One died in the first 3 seconds under Danner's fire. The other rolled and vanished downslope. From farther east, a PCAM opened at near level, round slicing brush to ribbons and driving Reyes's element flat. Elias dropped behind a boulder and shouted positions he could not hear himself say. The ridge was wider than it had looked from below. 50 meters of broken rock. Multiple scrapes. Spent brass scattered around one firing point. Food wrappers. Drag marks. This had not been a hasty stop. It had been prepared. Left gun. Danner shouted. No angle. Keene moved before Elias understood what she had seen. Not forward. Across. 3 fast steps and a crouch to a rock seemed nobody else had used because it looked too exposed from the front. From there, she got a narrow view into the eastern depression where the PCAM was firing from behind stacked stone and brush. She fired once. The gun stopped for half a second. Fired again. Stopped completely. Move. Cutter snapped. The line surged. That was the moment the team stopped treating her as attached support. Not because anyone said so, because in a fight, labels burned off fast, and all that remained was who opened the lane. They pushed across the shoulder and down into a shallow basin on the far side where the snow had begun to gather in the lee of rocks. There they found the first body clearly. Foreign fighter, black vest, chest wound, one hand still caught in the sling of a PCAM. Beside him lay a small radio set, battery warm. Fresh, Elias said. Cutter was already scanning the basin exit. They split here. Tracks confirmed it. One group, maybe 3 men, peeled east over broken stone. Another, heavier group with the limping man, drove north through a notch no wider than a truck hood. And there, half buried near the notch, was a tarp-covered bundle longer than a man's arm. Danner yanked it open. Launcher. Chinese-made recoilless tube cut short for pack carry. 2 rounds gone. 1 remaining. Reyes exhaled once through his nose. So much for no heavy weapons. No one wasted time on bitterness. Not yet. Then a round cracked from the north notch and hit the rock inches above Cutter's head. The fight was not over. It had only been divided. What followed was less a battle than a hunt conducted at sprint range. The northern group knew the terrain well enough to break line of sight every 10 seconds. They ran light, disciplined, using single shots and brief halts to pull the team over each piece of bad ground. Elias saw only fragments, heel flashes in the dark, a shoulder against snow, a hand pulling a brush. Once, The limping man stumbled, and another fighter physically shoved him upright. Whoever he was, he mattered. At 4:14, Reyes finally got a cleaner radio path to Assault 1. The answer came through in shattered pieces, but enough to matter. They had taken sporadic fire west of the saddle and were moving to box the northern drainage. If the enemy kept running north, they might drive straight into them. Might. The word did not comfort Elias. Mountains were graveyards for confident verbs. The notch opened onto a shelf above a deep drainage that dropped toward a frozen creek bed. The far side rose in terraced stone and dwarf pines. The shelf itself was exposed to the sky and swept by wind that now cut hard from the northwest. Snow hissed along the rock like dry sand. Tracks vanished there for 20 seconds and then reappeared in fragments, as if the men ahead had intentionally broken stride across stone to hide their count. Keen knelt near a scuff mark and touched the snow beside it. "What?" Elias asked, pausing with her under a rock lip while the front element cleared the next fold. She held up 2 fingers dusted in dark grit. "Machine oil." He looked again and saw a faint sheen against the white. "From the launcher?" She shook her head. "Too thin. Belt fed." He felt it then. The shape of the next problem before it arrived. "They staged another gun," he said. She looked toward the drainage and said nothing. The shelf narrowed. Cutter slowed the line and sent Danner forward with 1 man to check the bend. They had gone maybe 8 meters when Keene spoke, quietly, but with enough edge that Elias heard it over the wind. "Stop!" Danner froze mid-step, 1 boot hanging over a crack in the rock. "Back," she said. No explanation. None needed in her tone. Danner eased back 3 steps. Keene pointed with 2 fingers at what looked like nothing more than snow drifted into a shallow depression by the inside wall. Elias stared. Then he saw the pattern under the snow. A rectangle, 2 regular, 2 slightly raised at one side. "Mind," he whispered. "Not standard," she said. "Pressure lid or a buried frag charge." Danner crouched, brushed powder aside with the back of his glove, and exposed a cut section of yellow plastic jerrycan wired to a crushed metal pressure cap. He looked back at Keene. "That's 3. Only 3 we've seen," she said. The correction landed. Cutter rerouted the entire line along the outer edge of the shelf, which was safer from explosives and worse in every other way. The drop to the drainage below was maybe 40 feet at first, then much more beyond the next bend. Loose ice glazed the shadowed stone. A fall there would not have needed enemy help. At 4:21, they heard the helicopter weather call. It came thin and broken over Reyes's radio, but the meaning was clear enough. Cloud building from the northeast. Ceiling dropping. If the extraction birds did not launch by 5 o'clock, the window could close. Cutter checked time, distance, and the ridge ahead in 1 fast sweep. Then he made the only decision the mountain still left him. Finish it now. No one asked what finish meant. Capture if possible. Kill, if necessary. Recover what mattered. Get off the slope before weather and daylight turned the whole thing into a memorial briefing. The drainage bent north and widened into a bowl of stone and snow broken by black timber at the far edge. Elias smelled cordite before he saw the position. Fresh. Close. Danner signaled left. Reyes signaled right. They began to spread. Then the first burst came from behind them. Not ahead. Behind. Rounds slashed the shelf they had just crossed, hammering sparks from stone and forcing the rear security element down so violently that 1 man lost his rifle and nearly slid off the edge. Elias turned and saw muzzle flash from a rock pocket they had already passed. They had missed a stay-behind fighter. Or worse, the fighter had let them pass on purpose. Before anyone could fully pivot, shots answered from ahead as well. Single, accurate, walking into their available cover. The team dropped into a shallow crescent of stone with fire coming from both directions and the bowl below offering no clean escape. Cutter keyed his radio. Static. Reyes tried the alternate frequency. More static. Then a voice. Not theirs. Brief. Untranslated. Cut off. Interference. Enemy set. Weather. High ground. Time bleeding away. Elias felt the whole operation compress around a single truth. This was the kill box. Danner crawled to Cutter's side. We punch rear or forward. Forward, Cutter said immediately. Rear guns got the shelf. We break the bowl, take the north wall, collapse back on them. He turned to Elias. You stay center. Anybody drops, they breathe because of you. Then he looked at Keen. Not at her patch. Not at the roll she had arrived with. At her. Can you read that bowl? She lifted just enough to see over stone while rounds snapped through scrub above her head. Her eyes moved once, left to right, counting something Elias could not yet see. 2 positions ahead, she said. 1 high in the timber line. 1 low behind the split boulder. A beat. Rear gun is offset east. He can't depress fully into the center if we get under the lip. Cutter nodded. Decision made. You're with me. There was no resistance from anyone now. The push into the bowl happened fast, because slow would have been death. Smoke went first, gray blooming low and thin in the wind, useful for 2 seconds and then torn apart. Danner's element hammered the timber line. Reyes drove rounds into the split boulder. Cutter moved down the center with Keen, just off his right shoulder, Elias 2 paces behind, slipping on crusted snow and catching himself against stone. The low gun ahead fired blind through smoke. 1 round hit a rock beside Elias and sent shards through his sleeve. Another clipped Reyes's radio antenna clean off. Then Keen dropped to 1 knee and fired twice through a gap in the smoke no wider than a hand. The low gun died. They gained 10 meters. Then 15. The rear fighter opened again, sharper now, catching the team from an angle the bowl no longer masked. The man had shifted. Smart. He knew what they were doing. A round took the point man in the calf. Elias dragged him behind a rock, packed the wound, cinched a tourniquet above the boot, shoved him morphine he did not have time to wait on, and turned back uphill before the man finished cursing through his teeth. Snow blew sideways. The timber line ahead looked empty until it moved. 1 fighter broke from the trees and ran left, trying to clear the encirclement. Danner cut him down. Another stayed hidden and fired with enough patience that Elias could tell he was choosing heads, not shapes. That man hit Sam Danner at 431. The round came from high and oblique, slipping between plate and side seam as Danner rose to bound forward. It spun him, dropped him hard, and sent his rifle skidding across a patch of shale toward the outer lip of the bowl. He tried to get up once and failed. The second attempt got him to an elbow. Elias reached him first. Blood was already pumping dark under the vest line and spreading fast under his arm. Stay down, Elias said, hands moving. Danner's face had gone white under the green cast of the goggles. He grabbed Elias's sleeve with surprising force. Not through the plate. I know. Above them, Cutter was shouting for suppressive fire. Reyes was down to broken radio and hand signals. Keen had moved to a rock on the right and was firing uphill toward the timber line, buying seconds the team did not really have. Elias cut fabric, found the wound channel packed it hard. Too high for a simple tourniquet. Too much blood. Danner hissed once and then bit it back. Good man. Another burst tore rock above them. The rear gun had shifted again. Worse now. Closer to enfilade. We got to move him, Elias said. To where? Danner asked, and even bleeding he sounded irritated by the idea of being the problem. Elias looked. The nearest rail cover was upslope and wrong direction. Downslope was open shale, ending in dark. Keen slid in beside them, breathing hard, rifle up. Timber gun's still there, she said. He's waiting for movement. Elias glanced at her, then back to the wound. He packed deeper. Blood soaked the gauze almost instantly. Danner looked from Elias to the ridge, then to the rifle lying 6 feet away in the shale between them and the drop. Another shot cracked. Stone chips hit Elias's cheek. They were out of room, out of angle, out of time. Danner saw it too. His hand found Keen's sleeve, not gently. Run, he said, voice raw now, trying to shove her back toward the inner rocks before the next burst walked onto them. But she was already looking at the rifle. Her eyes moved once to the rear gun's line, once to the timber, once to the slope beyond the bowl where the wind was stripping snow off rock and carrying it sideways like smoke. Elias knew that look then. Not fear. Calculation. Danner shoved harder, blood on his glove. Run. Her hand closed around the rifle. Her hand closed around the rifle. For a fraction of a second, Elias thought she meant to drag it back to Danner. Then she went the other way. She dropped flat into the shale and slid toward the outer lip of the bowl, one shoulder leading, boots skidding for purchase while rounds snapped so close over her back that Elias could hear the difference between stone strike and clean miss. The movement was too fast to stop and too deliberate to mistake for panic. She did not lunge. She used the slope. Danner's rifle caught on a patch of frozen gravel. She hooked the sling with her left wrist, yanked it free, and let her own carbine hang against her chest. Keen, Cutter barked. She did not look back. Elias saw at once why she had gone. Danner's weapon was heavier than the short rifles most of the troop carried on direct action work. Danner favored a 7.62 platform in the mountains, said the extra weight and recoil were worth the authority at distance, and threw bad cover. Elias had heard him defend that choice on 2 different ranges, and once beside a fire barrel with a grin on his face and a cleaning rod in his hand. At that moment, sprawled on ice and shale, while half the ridge seemed to be trying to cut them apart, the choice stopped being preference and became geometry. The rifle gave her reach. She slid behind a stone no higher than her forearm, rolled on her side, and worked the charging handle once to confirm chamber. Her goggles were still down. The bowl ahead was a blur of gray smoke, broken brush, and black timberline. The rear gun behind them fired another burst and chewed a line through the slope where she had just been. Elias wanted to move after her. He could not. Danner was fading under his hands. The wound was high in the right lateral chest, just behind the plate line under the arm where armor coverage gave way to anatomy. Blood pumped darker now. Not the bright spray of a cut artery in open air, but the steady, ugly flooding of something deep and wrong. Elias packed harder, found resistance, packed deeper, and felt Danner's body tense around the pain. "Stay with me," he said. "I'm here," Danner muttered, though his voice had gone a little distant. His breath was shortening. That worried Elias more than the blood. Above them, Keen lifted the rifle and went still. Not rigid, settled. Elias had seen expert marksmen before. Some looked dramatic on the gun, all elbows and intensity. The truly dangerous ones seemed to disappear into the weapon. She disappeared. The timberline ahead looked empty until the wind eased. Then one branch twitched where the rest of the pines held steady. She fired once. The sound of Danner's rifle was deeper than the others, a harder punch that seemed to reach into the slope instead of just across it. The branch jerked. A figure folded out from behind the trunk and dropped into the snow. She did not stay on the body. Her left hand came off the handguard long enough to strip the magnification ring by feel, a quarter turn only. Then she shifted her hips and angled the muzzle back toward the rear shelf. The gun behind them had gone silent. Reload, Elias thought. Keen had heard it too. She pushed up just enough to clear the stone and fired through a slit in the rocks, scarcely wider than the rifle's receiver. Once. Twice. The second shot sent a metallic crack back across the shelf. Then a half-burst from the enemy gun went wild and high. "Move him!" Cutter shouted. The line acted at once. Reyes and one of the rear men bounded down, got under Danner's shoulders and hips, and dragged him backward while Elias kept one hand clamped under the packed wound and the other on Danner's vest straps to keep him from twisting open further. Shale scraped. Danner bit back a sound. A round hit close enough to shower them with snow and gravel, but the rear gun did not settle. Whoever was behind it was hurt, blind, or both. They hauled Danner under the inner lip of the bowl into a dead wedge of rock where the enfilade finally broke. Elias went to work. He cut the rest of the vest seam, peeled fabric, packed again, then slapped an occlusive dressing over the main wound and searched for an exit. None obvious. Bad sign. He checked Danner's chest rise. Uneven. Breath shallow. Faster now. Lips beginning to gray under the green wash of the goggles. "Tension coming," Elias said, mostly to himself. Danner's eyes found him. That the clinical term? It is tonight. He pulled a decompression needle from the med kit, found a landmark by touch under armor and cloth, then slid it into the lateral chest wall. A hiss of trapped air answered before the catheter seated. Danner's next breath came ugly but fuller. There it is, Elias thought. "Stay with me." Above them, Cutter and Reyes were already collapsing the fight. The timber gun was down. The low boulder position had gone quiet. That left the rear shelf and any runner still north. Keen did not wait for praise or instruction. She covered the shelf with Danner's rifle until Danner's own team moved through her field of fire. Only then did she rise and bound with them, low and fast, across the bowl's northern edge. That was when Cutter stopped trying to fit her into a role she had arrived with and started using her in the role the night had earned. Elias saw it happen in a glance. Cutter looked once toward her and pointed not to the rear, not to casualty cover, but toward the next fold of terrain where the ground became complicated again. Her answer was a single nod. Danner grabbed Elias's sleeve before he moved. How bad? Elias read the eyes, the skin tone, the chest. Bad enough to matter. Not bad enough to quit. Danner let out something that might have been a laugh if he had more air for it. Tell me if you start lying. You'll hear it. He got blood plasma into him, cinched Danner warmer against a freezing rock, and handed his monitoring to another operator trained enough to keep pressure and watch breath for 90 seconds. Then Elias climbed back into the fight because the line had already moved and there was no one else to keep up with it. The rear shelf was a pocket cut into the east side of the bowl, defended well if a man expected pursuit from below and less well if his gun team collapsed around him. They found the machine gunner on his back against the rocks, half buried in wind-blown snow, one shoulder shattered, weapon thrown clear by whatever had struck the receiver. Keen's second shot had not killed him. It had killed the gun. The distinction mattered to Elias. She had not fired for spectacle. She had fired for effect. A few feet away, the gunner's assistant lay face down with his hands under him and a blood trail leading north into the rocks. He crawled, Reyes said. No, Keen said, looking at the track. He was dragged for the first 2 meters. Cutter knelt beside the gun position. Empty belt can, 2 spare boxes, a battered field radio with a handset wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. The radio was still live, coughing static and clipped speech. One phrase came through clearly enough that even Elias, with only fragments of Pashto from years of hearing it around patrol bases and compounds, caught the directional word. South. Keen was already at Cutter's shoulder. She listened, waited, and translated without looking away from the handset. He says the ridge above the birds. He says hurry. The words seemed to lower the temperature by another 10 degrees. What ridge? Reyes asked. Keen pointed immediately, not north where the fleeing tracks led, but back over their own western shoulder, toward the chain of broken ground above the southern approach to the offset landing zone. Elias felt the whole night rearrange itself in his head. The pursuit north, the layered ambush, the mine shelf, the stay-behind gunner. It had all bought one thing. Time. Not for Baser to vanish into the high valleys. For a smaller element to swing back toward the extraction corridor and set a kill shot on the helicopters. Cutter took the radio, shoved it closer. Another burst of speech. Keen listened again. Tube to the ridge, she said. Before first light. Reyes glanced at the abandoned launcher tube they had left near the shoulder in his mind, then back at the shattered gun. You said 1 round left. In that tube, Keen said, meaning there could be another, or meaning the remaining round had been moved. Either way, the helicopters were now part of the fight, whether the pilots knew it yet or not. Cutter keyed his radio on primary, then alternate. This time the net held just long enough. Raven 1, this is Viking Actual. Possible threat to South LZ approach. Shift your block. Acknowledge. Static. Then a broken voice from Assault 1. Contact west of the drainage. Delayed. Repositioning. No visual south. Too far. Too late. Dawn was beginning to think about the eastern ridges now. Not light yet, but the black had thinned to deep iron at the horizon. Elias checked his watch. 4:38. The weather window for launch would close soon. The birds would either come into a threatened lane or scrub and leave the team walking a mountain full of enemies with a critical casualty and daylight at their backs. Cutter made decisions in stacks, one on top of the other, no wasted language. Reyes, hold the bowl with 2 men. Prep Danner for movement only if I call it. Elias, he stays breathing. Keen with me. Danner's rifle. Elias looked up. You're taking her north? South, Cutter said. That was the next inversion. The whole pursuit everyone had been reading as forward had become a false front. Keen was already scanning the snow around the shelf exit. Not the broad, obvious tracks that still punched north through the notch, but the quieter ground along the rocks. You saw it earlier, Elias said, coming to his feet. Not a question. She glanced at him once. I thought they might. Might what? Walk us away from the LZ. Cutter did not ask why she had not said it sooner. Elias understood the reason before the answer came. Until the radio confirmed the South Ridge, suspicion would have been just that. In those mountains, chasing every suspicion got men killed almost as quickly as ignoring them. What gave it to you? Elias asked. She pointed at the northern track line. The limp was wrong. He looked at the prints, annoyed at himself, because even now they only looked like tracks. Ow, too regular. She used Danner's rifle barrel to indicate spacing without touching the snow. It protected casualty in the middle breaks rhythm on turns. These don't. Same interval. Same depth for the last 40 meters. They wanted us watching the blood. She turned and pointed to a faint abrasion along the rock seam heading southwest, almost invisible under the new dusting of snow. Real movement hugged stone to hide count. One carried weight. You can see where his heel scraped under the load. Elias saw it then. Barely. A single dark mark under the lip of rock where snow had failed to settle evenly. The third footpath, he thought. It had been there from the beginning. Not just at the compound. In a whole plan. Cutter split the bull defense, left Reyes with Danner and the radio, and took a stripped-down chase element of 5. Cutter, Keen, Elias, and 2 operators lean enough to move fast after 4 hours at altitude. No one said what it meant to take the corpsman off the casualty when Danner still needed watching. They all knew. If the birds were hit on approach, Danner's odds became the least of the night's losses. The route south was not a trail so much as an argument with gravity. It angled across the backside of the ridge in a broken traverse where the rock rose in shelves and dropped in short, icy steps hidden by scrub. Keen took point with Danner's rifle across her chest and her own carbine hanging low under it, a burden any other man would have shed for speed. She kept both. Twice Cutter started to call a direction change, and stopped because she had already taken a cleaner line. Elias followed 10 feet back, lungs working hard in the cold, med bag thumping against his spine. The wind sharpened as they neared the southern face. Snow moved sideways now in fast white ribbons. The darkness thinned further. Shapes began to separate by distance rather than intuition. Below them, far beyond the folds of the mountain, the shelf that served as the offset landing zone was invisible from here. That was the point. The ridge above it, however, commanded the approach lane from the east. Anyone with a machine gun or launcher on that crest could rake the aircraft as they flared. The enemy knew the terrain well enough to build a plan around rotor arcs. At 4:47, they found the guide. Dead. He lay wedged in a juniper hollow with one hand under his chest, and his boots pointed north as if he had crawled there to die while the rest of the world kept moving. Local clothing. Trim beard, satellite phone crushed under his body. One round through the base of the skull. Executed, Elias said. For noise or delay, Cutter said. Keen crouched over the tracks around him. No delay. Discipline. Meaning the man had become unnecessary the moment he had delivered them to the ridge route. The satellite phone mattered more. Cutter pried it free. Cracked screen, still faintly lit. Recent call log. One save number without a name. No time to exploit it now. They moved. The ridge ahead narrowed into a spine with a shallow notch in the middle and rock shoulders on either end. To the south, the ground fell steeply toward the approach route. To the north, it rolled back into the basin they had left, invisible from the crest. Perfect place for a final stand, or a shot at an aircraft, or both. Keen stopped, so suddenly Elias almost ran into her. She raised a fist, then pointed to the snow on a low slab 3 meters ahead. There were no visible boot prints, only a scattered line of dark pinheads. Machine oil again. Not from a gun at rest this time. From a weapon carried muzzle down after rough movement. He's close, she said. Cutter slid left. One of the operators went right. Elias dropped to a knee behind a stone and listened. Nothing. Then, carried on a gust from the far side of the notch, came a sound so slight he might have missed it any other night. A metal latch tapping once against a launcher tube. Cutter heard it too. Elias saw it in the way his head turned. Then came the dull, far thunder of helicopters, still distant, swallowed by weather and terrain, but unmistakable to men who had spent years letting that sound mean either rescue or more work. Too early for comfort. Too late for another plan. The enemy had heard them too. Split, Cutter whispered. Keen with me center. Elias hold north shoulder. If they fire, kill the tube first. The order sounded simple. It was not. The next 20 seconds stretched into pieces Elias would remember separately for years. Snow skittering off stone in the gray before dawn. His own breathing too loud inside his skull. Keen moving one step at a time toward the notch with Danner's rifle already shouldered. The rotor sound building, then fading, then building again as the aircraft worked through weather in the valleys. A silhouette rising at the south edge of the crest with a tube on one shoulder. Not 100 meters away. Maybe 80. The launcher man had chosen his place well. He was tucked behind a low wall of rock with only the tube and the upper line of his torso exposed, pointed not at the team, but down into the invisible air lane where the Chinooks would have to nose up to clear the shelf. He was waiting for the aircraft, not the men. Keen fired before Elias could. Danner's rifle hit him square in the upper chest and knocked him backward off the wall. The launcher slewed sideways, struck stone, and fired. The rocket did not fly into the valley. It blew into the ridge itself. Stone and fire burst sideways across the crest. The blast slapped Elias flat and filled the notch with dust, smoke, and white fragments. One operator screamed once, and then not again. Cutter vanished in the blast cloud. For a second the world became pure concussion. Then gunfire came through it. Not from the launcher man. From two rifles lower on the far side. Men who had used the tube as bait or shield and were now trying to finish what it began. Elias rolled behind rock and found blood on his glove that was not his own. The operator who had gone right was down near the slab, leg bent wrong, shrapnel through the outer thigh, but alive and cursing. Elias dragged him deeper with one hand while searching for Cutter through the smoke. "Cutter," he shouted. No answer. Keen was already moving into the dust. Again, not towards safety. Toward the break in the ridge where the remaining rifles were firing from below. Elias saw her shape once, half swallowed by smoke and snow, carrying Danner's rifle high and her own carbine hanging empty against her armor. Then she dropped over the south face of the crest and vanished. No one in their right mind went over that edge under fire unless there was no other line left. The helicopters were louder now. The riflemen below were trying to fight uphill and stay hidden long enough to wait for the aircraft. If they held even 10 more seconds, one surviving shooter with a clean lane could do real damage to a helicopter full of fuel and men. Cutter appeared out of the smoke on hands and knees, helmet gone, blood down the side of his head, but eyes working. "Where is she?" he demanded. Elias pointed. Cutter swore once, softly, almost respectfully, and crawled to the lip. From where Elias was, he could not see the whole south face. He saw fragments. A boot's sole sliding on frozen dirt. A spray of snow where round struck. The black trunk of a stunted pine growing from the slope at an angle impossible enough to be useful. Then he saw Keen again, lower than he thought any human could move and stay controlled, using the cut of the hill as partial cover while she traversed toward the rifleman's blind side. It was not a heroic charge. That was what made it hard to forget. It was ugly, efficient, and nearly mechanical. She knew exactly how little of herself the men below needed to see to kill her, and she gave them less than that. 2 meters. Pause. Slide. Another meter. Pause. Wind. Move on the gust. Stop on the lull. Cutter saw it too. Hold fire. He snapped at no one and everyone. If the team shot now, they would light her position as surely as the enemy's. The riflemen below were focused on the crest, trying to catch heads rising through smoke. One leaned out from behind a rock to send a quick pair upward. Keen fired from his flank. The round hit low enough to spin him sideways rather than drop him clean. He rolled, clawed for cover. She moved again before he stopped moving. Using the fraction of confusion the first shot bought her. The second rifleman realized the danger then. He pivoted off the crest and fired downhill toward her position. 3 fast shots, each too high because he was reacting and not yet seeing. She answered once. Missed. Not by much. The rifleman ducked back and shouted something Elias could not make out. A third voice answered from lower on the slope. So there was one more. Of course there was. The impossible part of that morning was not that she found the angle. It was that she understood the whole problem quickly enough to know the angle would not hold for long. Elias watched her plant Danner's rifle against the root of the crooked pine, settle prone with her body canted across the fall line, and stop moving entirely while rounds snapped through the branches above her. The helicopters were near enough now that he could distinguish rotor beat from echo. Another 20 seconds, maybe 30. One of the surviving riflemen tried to relocate behind a second rock farther downslope, probably to open a clearer lane on the aircraft. He had to cross 6 feet of exposed snow to do it. She hit him halfway through the move. The third man, the one lower on the slope, Elias still had not seen, opened with a machine pistol or a short carbine from behind an outcrop almost directly below her. Dirt jumped along the hill toward the pine root. She slid sideways off the rifle, let the burst cut through where her torso had been, then came back up with her own carbine in both hands. So the sling rifle had not been empty. She had preserved it for the close problem. The exchange was brutally short. 2 bursts from below, 1 from her. Silence. The aircraft's sound swelled, banking now somewhere beyond the ridgeline. Cutter keyed his radio with blood running into his collar. Viking actual, ridge threat neutralized. Wave off direct south approach. Come high west if able. Acknowledge. For one terrible heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the pilot came back, thin and strained through static. Copy high west. 1 pass. 1 pass only. The words settled over Elias with almost physical weight. 1 pass. No backup run. No second try. He looked downslope again. Keen had not moved. For an instant fear cut through everything else. Then he saw her shift one arm, drag the launcher tube clear with her boot, and push herself up from the snow. She was alive. Cutter slid over the crest toward her before Elias could. Elias followed with the med bag, because that was still his job regardless of who had done what. The south face was steeper than it had looked from above, crusted snow over loose stone with enough blood and blast debris on it now to turn every step into a bad idea. The first rifleman she had hit was dead behind the rock, younger than Elias expected, no more than 20. The second lay lower down with a 7.62 wound that had dropped him mid-run. The third, short carbine, foreign boots, scar across his chin, was still breathing in wet, ragged pulls with Keen's burst through the upper abdomen. He tried to raise the weapon when Cutter approached. Cutter ended it with 1 controlled shot. No speech, no anger, just completion. Below them, half concealed under a tarp and brush line, not 20 meters from the crest, lay the rest of the final position. 2 additional rocket rounds, a compact radio repeater set with improvised antenna wire, and a canvas satchel full of notebooks, coded contacts, and folded paper maps waterproofed in tape. The courier package. The whole night, all the ambush lines, all the delay, had been built to pull that satchel and those rockets to the ridge above the aircraft lane. Baser had not been running from them. He had been repositioning the network. Elias turned when he heard Keen sit down hard on the slope. Only then did he see the blood on her sleeve. Not much at first glance. Enough on second. "It?" he asked, dropping beside her. She looked at the sleeve as if she had just remembered she was wearing it. "Graze. Show me." She handed him the rifle first. Even then, he took it and passed it to Cutter. Danner's weapon was hot, scratched, and white with stone dust along one side. Cutter held it for a second longer than necessary, then slung it over his own shoulder. Elias cut the sleeve seam. The round had shaved across the outside of her upper arm, tearing cloth and flesh but missing bone. Painful, bloody, survivable. He irrigated quickly from a squeeze bottle packed a pressure bandage around it, and check her eyes while he worked. "They ring?" he asked. "A little. That's better than a lot." She looked past him toward the valley where the rotor's sound thickened and lowered. In the growing half-light, her face had lost all remaining softness. Not hard in the theatrical sense, just emptied down of function. Cutter crouched beside the satchel and leafed through the top notebook with gloved fingers. Grid references, payment columns, pressure plate component lists, initials, times. Enough to justify every mile of the night if they could get it off the mountain. Then he found something else, a folded photograph tucked into the inner flap of the satchel. He opened it, studied it once, and handed it to Keen without comment. She looked at it for less than a second. Something changed in her face. Not much. A tiny withdrawal, as if a door behind her eyes had shut. Elias saw the photo only when she passed it on to him. 3 men standing beside a white Hilux in summer dust. One was clearly Baser from the target packet. Another was the district fuel trader whose name had floated through source reporting for 2 months without rising to suspicion. The third was an Afghan official from a border checkpoint unit that had been feeding coalition movements upward as cooperation. That was the betrayal. Not theory now. Proof. And if Elias had read her expression correctly, maybe not the first time she had seen one of those faces. "Know him?" he asked quietly. Her answer took a moment. "The traitor. That from another deployment?" "Yes." Nothing more. But the way she folded the photograph exactly on its old crease before handing it back told Elias there was history there, and not abstract history. Something unfinished. Something that explained why she had stared so hard at mirrored images and missing paths and men who smelled like diesel. The helicopter came in high west exactly as promised. Rotor washed shredding snow off the crest and whipping the smoke flat against the hill. The pilot did not have enough room for comfort and not enough time for hesitation. The Chinook flared nose up over the shelf below, rear wheels touching unevenly, ramp already dropping. One pass. Cutter split the load without ceremony. Satchel and radios with him. Casualties first. Danner moved with Reyes and 2 men from the bowl once the rest hauled him down from the ridge. The operator with the shrapnel wound could walk with help. The dead were secured as the living had to be. Fast, respectfully, without stopping. Elias stayed on Danner the whole way down the mountain shoulder, one hand on the chest seal, one watching breath. Danner drifted in and out, but never fully left, which Elias counted as victory in that air and cold. Halfway to the shelf, Danner opened his eyes and rasped, "My rifle." Elias looked upslope where Cutter and Keen were descending last, silhouettes against the paling ridge. "Still working," Elias said. Danner shut his eyes again. "Good." The aircraft lifted under weight and bad weather with the mountain still close enough to kill all of them if the pilot made one poor choice. Inside the cabin, men knelt around casualties, held pressure, tightened straps, and stared at nothing because adrenaline had nowhere to go in a vibrating metal tube. Keen sat on the deck opposite Elias with her wounded arm bound to her chest and Danner's rifle resting between her boots until Cutter took it from her and clipped it into the floor ring himself. She had gone pale with shock and blood loss, but not enough to stop watching Danner every few seconds, as if confirming with her own eyes that the night had not taken him after all. That was when Elias understood the other thing about her. She had not run because she had already lived through what happened when good men died inside mistakes no one corrected in time. He did not know the details. He never asked for them. He did not need them. The helicopter touched down in Jalalabad at 5:39. Danner went from aircraft to surgical team in less than 6 minutes. Elias ran beside the litter until the doors of the Roll 2 facility closed on him and the fluorescent hall took over from moonlight and rotor noise. Only then did the mountain begin to feel real. Debriefs started before blood had dried on some of the gear. That was normal. Intelligence degraded with every hour. Memory lied even faster. Elias gave his first statement, wrapped in a blanket with a paper cup of coffee gone cold again in his hand. Cutter gave his standing up despite the cut on his scalp. Reyes gave his beside a whiteboard covered in times and grid coordinates. Keene gave hers after a medic stitched the groove in her arm and tried twice to convince her to lie down. The intelligence officer from the briefing room was there too, face drained of every easy confidence he had carried the day before. So was a major from the task force staff and, later, 2 men from another office who asked narrower questions in quieter tones. The facts assembled themselves slowly. The source package had been compromised through the checkpoint official in the photograph and laundered through the fuel trader who serviced both government vehicles and insurgent couriers. The mirrored image in the brief might have been accident, sloppiness, or something darker. No one proved intent. The unreported third path and the tunnel exit had not been oversights to the men who built the ambush. They had been assumptions quietly protected inside reporting chains because the source had been productive in previous months and no one wanted to be the first to say the product had changed. The guide on the ridge had indeed been executed by Baser's men when they no longer needed him. The radio repeater and rocket rounds on the south crest were set for the extraction corridor, and the notebooks in the satchel named bomb makers, facilitators, storage caches, and payment lines stretching through 3 districts. That intelligence alone would lead to 6 follow-on raids, 14 captures, and the seizure of enough explosives and pressure plates to change what happened on more than one road in the months that followed. But that was the clean summary. It did not tell the human part. 3 days later, Danner came out of surgery and stayed alive. That was the first measure that mattered to Elias. The bullet had missed his lung by less than an inch after entering through the lateral seam, then ricocheted off a rib and torn ugly work through muscle before lodging where the surgeons could reach it. Another half hour on the mountain without decompression and blood control might have made the question academic. Elias visited him after the second operation, when the machines had dwindled and Danner could almost make a joke without falling asleep halfway through it. He looked thin against the sheets and furious about it. "Tell me she didn't break the rifle," he said. Elias sat down. "You've got strange priorities." "Did she?" "No." Danner stared at the ceiling for a while. "Good." Then, after another long pause, "You see that shot on the crest?" "Yes." He nodded once as if checking a box no one else could see. "Thought so." He never made a performance out of gratitude. Neither did she. When Keene visited 2 days later with her arms still bandaged and a tray of awful hospital coffee balanced in one hand, Danner looked at her for a long moment and then at the cup she offered him. "You took the heavy one," he said. "You dropped it. I noticed. That was all." But Elias was in the room, and he knew respect when he heard it. The formal report took longer. At first it read like reports usually did. Mission objective, contact timeline, casualty data, recovered material, follow-on value. It named the troop, the pilot's one-pass extraction, the shift, and enemy intent. It mentioned attached female support soldier in 3 places and Keene by name in 1. Elias saw that draft and set it back down very carefully because anger in rooms like that needed handling. Cutter did not handle it carefully. He sent it back, not with speeches, with corrections. He added the mirrored image challenge in the pre-mission brief, added the identification of the threshold trap, added the warning in the wash, added the mine on the shelf, added the radio translation that turned the pursuit south, added the shots on the timberline, the destroyed rear gun, the interception of the launcher team on the crest. He wrote it in the dry language the system trusted most. Fact, effect, outcome. When the amended packet came back, one line had been softened. He sent it back again. This time Reyes signed under him. Danner did too from recovery, in handwriting that leaned badly because he was still healing. Elias added a medical statement, not because he wanted to join a fight about awards, but because the survival timeline made the point impossible to avoid. If the ridge had not been reopened when it was, his patient would have died before extraction. The major on the task force staff tried once to reduce the whole question into institutional caution. "Recognition should reflect the team," he said. Cutter answered without raising his voice. "It does. That's why I'm correcting the team record." The room stayed quiet after that. The citation process moved in fits. Recommendations were drafted, reduced, argued, elevated, and delayed. Some of that was bureaucracy. Some of it was discomfort in older structures being asked to describe clearly what had happened when a woman attached for cultural engagement became the tactical hinge of a special operations fight. Justice arrived the way it often did in war. Late, reluctant, but not absent. Months after the mountain, with the notebooks already exploited and the checkpoint official in a black site cell and Baser dead in another valley during a follow-on operation driven partly by the contacts taken from the satchel, the award was approved. Silver Star. The citation named none of the locations that mattered most and replaced faces with phrases like hostile force and rugged mountainous terrain. Classified language always stripped the blood from the floor, but it preserved the essentials. Under withering fire, repeated exposure to enemy positions, neutralization of multiple threats, prevention of catastrophic aircraft loss, actions above and beyond assigned duties, gallantry. Elias stood in the back at the ceremony because that was where corpsmen and old operators stood when the thing being recognized belonged mostly to somebody else. Keene wore dress uniform like she wore field gear, without any interest in being admired for it. When a medal was pinned on, she did not smile for the cameras the way the public affairs officer probably hoped. She nodded once to the general, turned, and found her seat again. Afterward, in the parking lot behind the headquarters building, Danner met her with one arm still not lifting quite right and held out a rifle case. She looked at it. "No, it's yours for now," he said. She shook her head. "It's yours." "Was," he said. "That night changed chain of custody." She almost smiled then, which on her face looked less like amusement than a brief easing of old pressure. Elias watched from a few feet away while she opened the case. Inside was the same rifle, refinished and re-zeroed, a fresh gouge still visible on one side of the handguard where the rock on the ridge had bitten through the finish. Danner had not sanded it out. She touched the mark once with her thumb. Then she closed the case and handed it back. "Keep in the team room," she said, "where people can ask the wrong question about it." Danner studied her, then nodded. "Fair." That became the beginning of the legacy before any official office could design one. The mission drove changes. Not dramatic reforms announced on stages. Smaller, harder changes that actually lasted. Source packets on the task force were thereafter required to include independent terrain validation when the targets sat on high ground. Mirrored or low-confidence imagery could no longer slide through on trust. Assault briefs added a formal challenge phase where the quietest person in the room was expected to say what did not fit. Extraction lanes received dedicated threat review from the objective backward, not just from the base outward. And somewhere in those updates, though no one admitted whose phrase it had been first, a line began appearing in dry doctrinal slides and instructor notes. Find a third path. The younger men liked the phrase because it sounded tactical. The older men respected it because they knew what it had cost to learn. Keene did not stay in the same attached role forever. Wars changed. Units changed. Policies caught up to realities they had long pretended not to see. She moved through other deployments, other mountains, other bad briefings, and eventually into instruction more often than direct pursuit. That surprised no one who had watched her on the ridge. She taught the way she fought. Calmly. Precisely. No speeches. Elias visited one of those courses years later on a cold morning in North Carolina, when pine wind cut through the ranges and a class of younger operators and enablers stood around a table covered in overhead imagery, route sketches, and weather cards. Keene stood at the front in a soft-shell jacket with the old scar under her jaw a little wider than he remembered and a marker in her left hand. The room was warm. The coffee was terrible. Half the students thought they were there to learn tracking. The smart half had already realized they were there to learn doubt. She projected a grainy compound photo onto the wall. "Tell me what's wrong with it," she said. No one answered immediately. One young staff sergeant offered the obvious issue first: poor resolution. Another said the source angle was too high to read doors. A third pointed out the lack of recent weather data. Keene nodded to each and wrote nothing. Then one woman at the back, newer than the rest and careful with her voice, said, "The wall shadow doesn't match the marked entrance." The room went quiet. Elias felt something shift inside him that had very little to do with pride and almost everything to do with continuity. Keene capped the marker. "Good," she said. Now ask what else the photo wants you to assume. No flourish. No story from Afghanistan. No mention of medals or helicopter lanes or a wounded man on a ridge telling her to run. Just the work. At lunch, Elias found her outside by the gravel lot, standing in the cold with a paper cup in both hands and watching a line of trainees move toward the range carrying rifles and laminated route cards. "You use the same battery trick?" he asked. She looked at him. "Wool sock." He smiled. "Still stealing my lines. The cold takes what it can." There was again. He glanced through the window at the projection screen inside. The image had changed to a topographic map with contour lines marked in red and blue grease pencil. 3 possible routes in, 2 likely exits, 1 uncertain cut through broken ground on the north side. "Do they know?" he asked. "About what?" "The ridge. The bowl. Any of it." She watched the trainees shoulder through the wind. "They know enough." That was her way. History reduced to usable weight. Elias did not press further. He never told her that Danner still kept the original gouged handguard in the team room after the rifle itself was reissued, mounted low near the gear lockers where new men often missed it the first week and asked about it the second. He never told her that Cutter, retired by then and grayer than he had ever seemed possible, still referred to inadequate source packets as wrong wall work. He never told her that on bad nights, when extraction weather turned and radio nets frayed, and some young corpsman somewhere had to decide which wound would get his next 5 seconds, her name traveled in stories stripped of sentiment and polished by repetition until it became not legend exactly, but standard. He did not need to tell her. She had built something larger than recognition by then. A few years after that, Elias attended a memorial for Reyes, who died not in combat, but in the ordinary blunt way bodies sometimes settle their old accounts. Men from 3 different wars came back for it. So did Keene. So did Danner, moving easier now, but still a little guarded in the shoulder when the weather changed. After the service, they stood outside under a pale winter sky and said the kinds of things men say when they have run out of dramatic language for losses that count. Danner looked older. Cutter looked smaller. Keene looked much the same, which Elias thought was its own kind of burden. A younger operator from a generation after theirs approached with the uncertain confidence of a man walking toward names he had heard for years. "Ma'am," he said to Keene, "I'm in a mountain package next month. They told us to ask about the third path." She studied him for a second. "Did they tell you what it means?" He hesitated. "Assume there's another route." "That's half of it," she said. He waited. "The other half is this. If something in the brief makes you comfortable too early, it's probably hiding the route that matters." The young operator nodded like a man, trying to memorize not the sentence, but the weight behind it. When he left, Danner looked at her and shook his head once. "What?" she asked. "You still don't tell stories right. They're not there for stories." "No," he said, glancing toward the younger man by the cars. "I suppose not." Years later still, on a day of low cloud and cold rain, Elias stopped by the team room of a unit, not his own, to drop off medical training notes, and found the gouged handguard where Danner had said it would stay, mounted on dark wood. No brass plate, no explanatory paragraph, just the scar in the metal, and, underneath it in marker faded by time and handling, for words. "Find the third path." A new breacher was standing beneath it, frowning upward. "What's that from?" the breacher asked. Elias looked at the mark in the metal, at the bright line where rock had once bitten through finish on a ridge above a bowl full of smoke and bad ground, and he thought of mirrored walls, wool-wrapped batteries, machine oil on snow, a boy in sandals looking up the wrong wash, a helicopter pilot committing to one pass, and a woman who had looked at her rifle in the shale and understood the whole shape of the next minute before anyone else did. "An after-action correction," he said. The breacher laughed softly, assuming there was more to the answer than he was getting. There was. But the best lessons rarely survived being over-explained. By then, the mountain itself had changed hands more than once. Compounds had fallen and been rebuilt. Paths had washed out and formed again. Men in offices had rotated, promoted, retired. Reports had yellowed in files few people opened. Even Baser's notebooks had become references inside other references, intelligence absorbed into the larger machinery and stripped of the ridge wind and blood that made it real. What remained lived elsewhere. In the pause before a young operator accepted an image as complete. In the extra look at a wall shadow. In a hand brushing frost off a trail to see what passed through after moonrise. In a corpseman packing gauze while trusting somebody else to win back the seconds medicine required. And in briefing rooms, from Carolina to Colorado, to places no map on the wall admitted by name, where a quiet voice would sometimes interrupt a smooth plan and ask why the entrance and the shadow did not agree. The room would change after that. It always did, because somewhere between the shelf above Jalabad and the cold ridge where the helicopters almost flew into a trap, one woman had refused the easy route through a story already being written for her. She had taken the heavier rifle, the narrower angle, and the part of the mountain everyone else had nearly agreed not to see. Years later, on another winter morning, Elias watched a new class file out to a range under a sky the color of worn steel. Their rifles were slung tight. Their batteries were wrapped against the cold. One of them carried a notebook with a single line boxed twice at the top of the page. Not objective, not target, not exfil, just this. Third path missing. And when the door shut behind them and the room fell quiet again, the old image on the screen still held its wrong wall in the pale light, waiting for the next person who knew how to look.